Good morning and welcome to the 6th meeting of 2026 in Session 6 of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. We have apologies from Pam Gossel this morning. Maggie Chapman and Paul McLennan are joining us remotely. Our first agenda item is to agree to take agenda item 10, which is consideration of our ongoing work on non-implementation of legislation. Our members agreed to take this item in private. Members are agreed. Thank you. Our second agenda item this morning is consideration of the Legal Aid and Advice and Assistance Fees Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2026 Draft Affirmative Instrument. I therefore welcome to the meeting Siobhan Brown, Minister for Victims and Community Safety, and the Minister is accompanied by Kieran MacDonald, Legal Aid Reform Team Leader, and Emma Thompson, Lawyer at the Scottish Government's Legal Directorate. You're all very welcome and thank you for attending this morning. I refer members to papers 1 and 2 and invite the Minister to speak to the draft instrument.
Thank you and good morning, Committee, and thank you, Convener. I welcome the opportunity this morning to speak to the Legal Aid and Advice and Assistance Fees Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2026. This SSI forms part of the Scottish Government's programme of legal aid reform, which aims to strengthen access to justice and ensure the system remains fair and sustainable for those who need it the most. The instrument will increase solicitors' fees and fixed payments for criminal, civil and children's legal aid and advice and assistance by 13%, commencing on the 1st of September 2026. Additionally, this SSI makes some further changes to legal aid, amending regulations laid in December last year, and also meets a commitment given by the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee to make corrections and minor drafting and clarification changes to the Civil Legal Aid Scotland Regulation 2002 and the Advice and Assistance by Way of Representation Scotland Regulations 2003. This SSI has been developed in close collaboration with the Law Society of Scotland and the Scottish Solicitors Bar Association, and I would like to express my thanks for their valuable contributions to the negotiations. Also like to extend my gratitude to the Scottish Legal Aid Board for its input on the technical and also the operational aspects of the fee increase. This SSI provides a significant increase to solicitors' fees, which will ensure legal aid professionals are better remunerated and supported, allowing them to continue to make a real difference to people's lives. The 13% increase in solicitors' fees addresses the profession's concerns and contributes positively to the retention of legal aid solicitors, as it decreases the potential risk of them stopping legal aid work. This would have a detrimental impact on access to justice and solicitor availability, as the committee did hear about this in your evidence in the recent inquiry into civil legal assistance. The Law Society of Scotland have publicly welcomed the 13% fee increase, calling it, and I quote, a lifeline for access to justice. This SSI forms part of a broader package of reform that includes the establishment of an independent fee review mechanism group, which will help shape the future of legal aid by creating a robust, evidence-based process for reviewing and agreeing legal aid fees. The package also includes further secondary legislation coming into force on the 1st of April, the 1st of June and 14th of December this year, as approved by the committee on the 3rd of February. Additionally, there will be funding for 40 traineeships, with digital support for new trainees will be provided as part of a fee uplift package of reforms to further support access to justice. This package demonstrates the Scottish Government's commitment to a long-term investment in the talent pipeline into the legal aid profession. In summary, Convener, this fee uplift reaffirms our commitment to continuing to provide a robust legal aid system, supporting solicitors to provide crucial legal aid services, which in turn allows people access to justice whenever they may need it. We aim to ensure that people get the help that they need and that the solicitors are there to provide it. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Minister. We will now move on to members' questions. And firstly, I'll invite Maggie Chapman, please.
Thank you very much, Convener, good morning, Minister. Firstly, I'm sorry I can't join you in person, but thank you for that update. And I think this is very welcome news, as you say, the 13% uplift. I just have a couple of questions around this and ongoing work. Firstly, I'm interested in the 13% figure that was arrived at. We know it was about 15 months ago when we discussed court fees for individuals to pay. There were some much higher increases in those fees, and one of the arguments was around full cost recovery. One of the things that came through very clearly in our legal aid inquiry was that legal aid wasn't paying its own way for solicitors. What assurances can the Minister give that this 13% increase is actually enough to allow solicitors to fully cover their costs and ensure that this is properly fair compensation for the vital work that legal aid solicitors do?
Yes, and I thank the member for her question. There has been a long period of negotiations over the last 12 months with the Law Society and the Scottish Solicitors Bar Association regarding this uplift, and this is where we have come to the 13%. There was, as you know, action being taken that was ceased last December. So this is the figure that we have come negotiated to, which, as I said in my opening speech, that the Law Society have said is going to be a lifeline to the profession. But just on top of that as well, the fee mechanism group, which has also been established and had its first meeting in December last year, that's a really important group which has been set up, and that's been asked for many, many years, so that fees can then now be periodically or annually reviewed, which was a really important factor to the profession. So I'm confident now with a 13% increase and the fee mechanism group set up that we're on stable footing moving forward.
Thanks very much, Minister. That's really helpful. And I suppose just a follow-up question from that, given the conversations that can happen and the annual reviews that can happen, I suppose I'm just curious as to why the 13% increase applies from September this year and how that has an impact on potential increases in the future, given the work of that fee group.
Yes, so I think with some of the reform that we've been doing through secondary legislation, there will be uplifts coming into place in April, 1st of April, 1st of June, and also the 14th of December. This 13% that will come into place on the 1st has been negotiated with the profession as well. There's operational aspects with SLAB that will have to be put in place, and also for the profession to get it in place, so it's not something that can be done overnight. So I think with discussions with the profession, they're quite happy for it to be introduced on the 1st of September.
Okay. Thanks. And my final, really just a point, we received last night the sort of update or the schedule, the timeline of the different activities that are happening around legal aid reform. I just wanted to put on record my thanks for that. I know there's a lot of work going on in this space. And whilst we don't have the legislation yet for legal aid reform, it's really helpful to see laid out, as you did in your correspondence, the other elements that are going on. I'll leave it there, Convener. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We now have questions from Paul McLennan, please.
I suppose, and it's great to hear, obviously, the progress and the discussions they had. I suppose it's kind of looking almost towards the next Parliament as well, and it's kind of almost around about, the committee also made some other recommendations on civil legal assistance kind of going forward, and I think you've mentioned this in the Chamber as well. It's more just in terms of where you see, is there anything else needing done in what we have left in this term, and also kind of what you see the objectives in the medium to longer term when Parliament comes back in for its new session?
Thanks, Mr McClellan, for that question. I know, and apologies for the letter that came. I know it was late night last night, and I know it's got a lot of detail in it, so I'm unaware if all the committee's been able to go through it. But I have been able to outline some of the work that I've been trying to get forward through the secondary legislation in this parliamentary term. As we look ahead into the next parliamentary term, it will be up to the next government to take forward, but I do think that it will be including developing new primary legislation to modernise the legal aid framework with the aim of introducing clearer and more flexible system and supporting longer term reform there as well. So we're also, just on top of that, which I can guarantee will go forward because it was part of this Scottish Government, we had the implement of the provisions of the Regulation of Legal Services Bill, which passed last year, and that will include the phased commencement of licensed provider provisions that will support the delivery of the Legal Aid Traineeship Fund by the Law Society to support long-term workforce resilience alongside ongoing valuation to strengthen legal aid as well.
Just a supplementary, if that's okay, Convener, and I think, Minister, you remember, I probably asked this in the Chamber as well, was obviously around about making sure accessibility to more remote areas. And again, I don't know if you want to just touch on that. I know you gave me an answer in the Chamber, but more just for the committee kind of stuff. But just a little bit more you can say about equality of accessibility for those in remote areas.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is where it's really important as we move forward into the next parliamentary term and you look at the primary legislation for legal aid reform and all the recommendations from this committee's civil legal aid report will all be taken into account for the next Scottish Government to move forward.
Thank you, Convener. Thanks, Minister.
Okay, thank you. We now have a question from Tess White, please.
Thank you, Convener. Before I ask my main question, may I ask the Minister, the 40 traineeships that you mentioned at the start is definitely to be welcomed, so thank you for that. May I ask, in terms of those traineeships, will you be requiring any of the trainees who have qualified to actually give back, let's say, X number of years, so that once they're qualified, they're focusing on legal aid rather than going into other types of law?
So, yes, I think originally it was 20 traineeships, which in the negotiations has now gone up to 40 traineeships with the digital support package. We are continuing to discuss with the Law Society the terms and conditions of that. I might bring in Kieran to talk about if that has been raised by the profession.
We're still negotiating and talking about it, so we'll be looking into detail of it. We'll to share that with you.
Okay, so that's government funded, but there might be some requirement so that they do actually spend time on legal aid cases. Thank you for that. So my question, Minister, is, and it's something that my colleague Paul McClellan touched upon, the longer term legal aid reform. And it's difficult to say because that's the next parliamentary session. But is it something that you have stressed to say reform is long overdue and it needs to be looked at very, very quickly?
Yes, so I think, and I think we went through this in the last committee as well, the kind of work I've been trying to do in the last 18 months, and I think it's outlined in the letter that was sent to the committee members yesterday. So there's a lot of work that has been done. Moving forward, there will be primary legislation from the next Scottish Government, although, as we know, that doesn't happen quickly. But in the meantime, moving forward, I am still having discussions with Scottish Legal Aid Board about priorities and things in second legislation that can be done in the next parliamentary term. So these conversations are ongoing so that we can maximise as much reform that we can do before we do the primary legislation. So I hope that gives you some comfort.
Thank you, Minister, because when we had the debate, and part of the conclusions was that, let's say, women fleeing domestic abuse and the recommendation that the financial thresholds are actually removed. That was one. And in terms of the Scottish Legal Aid Board, SLAB is an unfortunate word, but there was heavy criticism of SLAB and the bureaucracy. Is that something that you have addressed with SLAB since we raised it in our debate?
Yes, so I always have ongoing conversations with SLAB. I met with them last week. I think we have to, from my position, be very, very clear that the work that SLAB do is vital. We've got like £170 million legal aid budget, and they play a huge role in legal aid reform. As I said, I think in the last committee session that we discussed this, that there is an acknowledgement when we're doing legal aid reform that it will include parts of SLAB as well, and they are totally open to that as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Minister. Back to you, Convener.
Okay. Thank you. We now have questions from Rhoda Grant, please.
Thank you. Can I ask what other things are happening to help provide legal advice in rural areas? I mean, obviously increases in fees helps, but there are so many other things, distance travelled, just how people access that. Is there any other things you're looking at?
So yes, I think the negotiations that we have been having for the last couple of months has primarily been on fee uplifts, so that the solicitors can get the fees that come in September, which so hopefully will attract more people into doing legal aid across Scotland, which of course will be beneficial and impact the rural areas. I take on board, I think from the last committee session that you referred to, maybe having a rural group and focusing on rural legal aid in the next parliamentary term, which if I was a minister, I'd be very happy to pursue that and how we can make improvements to legal aid in the rural areas of Scotland.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We will now move on to agenda item 3, which is the formal debate in relation to the instrument. I therefore invite the Minister to move the following motion. S6M 20605, that the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee recommends that the draft legal aid and advice and assistance fees miscellaneous amendment Scotland Regulations 2026 be approved.
I move that the legal aid and advice and assistance fees miscellaneous Scotland Regulations 2026 be approved by this committee.
Thank you, Minister. Do members have any comments to make? If not, are we all agreed? Okay, that is agreed. Next, I invite members to agree to delegate to me approval of the publication of a short factual report on our deliberations on the affirmative instrument that we have considered today. Are we all agreed? Thank you. We're all agreed. Therefore, that concludes this agenda item, and I thank the Minister and officials once again for their attendance today. Thank you. Just move on. Our next item of business is consideration of the following 3 negative Scottish statutory instruments. SSI 2026/33, the Upper Tribunal for Scotland Procedure Rules Miscellaneous Amendment Regulations 2026. SSI 2026/34, the First Tier Tribunal for Scotland Procedure Rules Miscellaneous Amendment Regulations 2026. SSI 2026/35, the Mental Health Tribunal for Scotland, Practice and Procedure No. 2 Amendment Rules 2026. I refer members to paper 3. Do members have any comments to make on any of the instruments? No. No member has indicated that they have any further comments to make. Therefore, are members content not to make any comment to the Parliament on any of the instruments? Thank you. That concludes consideration of the instruments, and we will now suspend briefly to set up for our next agenda item. Thank you. Welcome back. Our fourth agenda item this morning is to take evidence on the Scotland-specific issues raised in the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, concluding observations and recommendations. The Scottish Government published its high-level action plan in November 2025, which sets out how it intends to respond to the recommendations. I therefore welcome to the meeting CoCab Stewart, Minister for Equalities, and the Minister is accompanied by Ellie Contreras, Head of Human Rights Implementation and International Policy, and Kevin McGowan, Unit Head of the Scottish Government's Equality Division. You're all very welcome and thank you for attending this morning. I refer members to papers 4 and 5 and invite the Minister to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Convener and committee members. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to provide an update on the steps that this government has taken to respond to the concluding observations made by the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in February. I last appeared before you on this topic in May 2025 and I corresponded with you in November, where I was able to provide you with further detail. In November, the Scottish Government published a high-level action plan that directly responds to each of the UN Committee's recommendations relating to devolved matters. Civil society and expert voices shaped our approach, which moves away from earlier narrative position statement and now focuses squarely on the actions that we are taking across a wide range of economic, social and cultural rights. This high-level action plan reaffirms our commitment to further embedding treaty obligations more deeply into policy and practice and provides a practical framework to support collaboration, accountability and scrutiny. It is important to remember that since the last State Party review in 2016, we have faced major global and domestic challenges, including EU exit, the COVID-19 pandemic, and ongoing impacts of the war in Ukraine, a rising cost of living, and increasingly divisive rhetoric affecting community cohesion. These pressures have underscored the need to place human rights, especially economic, social and cultural rights, at the centre of policy and practice. And Scotland's most recent programme for government reflects this, setting out our ambitious actions to advance our 4 priorities: eradicating child poverty, growing the economy, tackling the climate emergency and delivering high-quality, sustainable public services. During the UN's committee evidence session in February 2025, they welcomed Scotland's distinct approach to human rights, particularly our proposals for a human rights bill to incorporate the ISCAR into domestic law within devolved competence, building on this Parliament's leadership in the incorporation of the UNCRC. The UN Committee also recognised a public health-led strategy on alcohol and drug harms, which the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has acknowledged is the first of its kind in the world. But we know that we must continue to do more. Our high-level action plan therefore sets out what we are doing and will do across a wide range of devolved areas, including fair work, social security, child poverty, housing, education and cultural rights. This work sits within our wider ambition to foster a rights-based respecting culture in Scotland, increasingly embedding human rights across government through our National Performance Framework, supported by Scotland's second National Action Plan for Human Rights and the recently published Equality and Human Rights Mainstreaming Strategy, Toolkit and Action Plan. The publication of this high-level action plan marks a significant milestone within our wider programme to strengthen the implementation of international treaty body recommendations as part of a wider approach to human rights in Scotland. And as I updated you in May, another important element of this work is the development of the new Human Rights Tracker. The tracker will consolidate treaty body recommendations into a single, accessible online platform. It will support us all to identify and act on international recommendations in a strategic and coordinated way, helping to enhance our rights implementation efforts in devolved areas. The first phase of this work will provide a centralised and transparent record of recommendations arising from the 7 core UN treaties to which the UK is a signatory. In time and subject to the outcome of the Scottish Parliament elections, I intend to continue to work with stakeholders to develop a methodology for clearly and consistently reporting on action taken and outcomes. This tool was a key SNAP2 recommendation. The tool aims to support an increasingly systemic monitoring of progress, helping to identify any gaps and areas for improvement and strengthening accountability for actions on devolved matters. This was a key SNAP2 recommendation, and I look forward to seeing it launched in this parliamentary session. And I'm pleased to confirm that the first phase of this tracker will go live on the 12th of March. And I have extended an invitation to you to the launch event and demonstration via the committee clerks. And I'm very grateful to them for their time as members of the Tracker Design Group in recognition of these sorts of tools that can support greater parliamentary scrutiny. In parallel with our domestic implementation agenda, I've also had the pleasure of showcasing our distinct approach to human rights in various engagements with international human rights specialists over the last couple of months. In November, the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice and I met with the Council of Europe's Commissioner for Human Rights, Michael O'Flaherty, and we used this opportunity to highlight our human rights approach to social security and the action that we are taking to eradicate child poverty, as well as reaffirming Scotland's support for the European Convention on Human Rights. The Commissioner recognised the value of our work on incorporation of international human rights treaties, and we expect to see a memo following his visit later on. Also in November, at COP30, the Scottish Government announced a grant of £150,000 in support of the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change. Through this, Scotland is not only contributing to global discourse, but also helping to enable inclusive, rights-based responses to the climate crisis. And last month, the Parliament welcomed Alexandra Kazanthanki, forgive my pronunciation there, the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights to Scotland at an event hosted by the organisation Art27. As a former Culture Minister, I was particularly pleased to have the opportunity to emphasise that cultural rights are not just a nice-to-have, but inherent rights that we want to give greater protection to through our Human Rights Bill proposals. So in conclusion, Convener, I understand that today's evidence session will focus specifically on the high-level action plan in response to the UN Committee's recommendations, and I welcome this opportunity. I remain committed to working together to strengthen good practice in the implementation, reporting and follow-up to international human rights treaty bodies. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Minister. We will now move on to questions from members, and I'm going to kick us off this morning and ask Minister what specific progress has been made on the Human Rights Bill.
Thank you, Convener. We are continuing to make good progress on further developing and refining the Human Rights Bill proposals, and our goal to bring this forward the bill that is ambitious, effective and, of course, will bring positive change In July last year, we were pleased to publish the detailed discussion paper on our work proposals for the Human Rights Bill, and that paper consolidates the extensive work that has been undertaken to date and is supporting further engagement with stakeholders. So we're continuing to test and to refine the proposals and to work through the implications for further incorporation legislation, building on the learning from the Human Rights Act of 1998 and the UNCRC Act of 2024. So, as the committee is aware, the UK Supreme Court judgment in 2021 on the UNCRC and the Euro Charter bills has implications for the potential scope of the proposed duties, and we're continuing to use this time to chart a way forward here. So, the committee has been kept informed throughout the work that we've undertaken on developing the proposals, and will continue to provide updates to the relevant committees following the 2026 elections. And it's worth noting that when myself and the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice met with the Council of Europe Commissioner on Human Rights, the Commissioner described our incorporation agenda as an impressive body of work which will be of interest to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights also.
Okay, thank you. I have a supplementary on this question from Rhoda Grant, please.
Just on that, what are the specific issues that are causing concern? The non-devolved and devolved issues, and how do you expect to overcome them?
Yeah, so I'll bring Ellie in on that. However, as an overview of that, bringing so many treaties together, and some of them obviously for the first time as well. We're sort of leading away. We're being very ambitious in that, and where they all sit together with all the different sort of like reserved powers, devolved powers, also the European Convention as well. We're navigating all these different sort of like spaces that have, different rules, different regulations, different scopes and things. So to bring that all together, we have to work through that systemically and systematically to make sure that whatever we have actually has an impact on people's lives. And I always try and remember that that is actually the bigger aim, is that it's not a paperwork exercise or a challenge in that sense. The challenge is how effective will it be? Does all the legislation sit together? But I can bring in Ellie here on some further detail into the compatibilities.
Thank you, Minister. So, as the Minister noted, we're continuing to engage with the UK Government on the challenges resulting from the interpretation of the Supreme Court judgment. And on that, really welcome the recent publication from the University of Glasgow's Centre for Public Policy, which reports on this issue and makes clear that this is an issue that requires cross-government cooperation and collaboration to really resolve. One of the things that the Minister has really noted in her chairing of the Human Rights Incorporation and Implementation Oversight Board is that this legislation is complex, and we're working with stakeholders to really work through that complexity and make sure that the bill is able to be delivered and effective and impactful on the ground. And one of the other areas, in addition to the UNCRC scope matter, is these group protection treaties. So making sure that the duties that are applied are workable and are consistent with the Equality Act.
So practically, what does that mean? Where are the difficulties and how easy are they to overcome? Do we need to be granted devolved responsibility in areas, or are there areas we cut out of the bill that will infringe on non-devolved issues? I mean, where does all this fall?
Well, I suppose sort of like an example that I could give is sort of like what we've already got. So listening very carefully, I suppose, to the feedback on the challenges that resulted from the UNCRC compatibility duty and to the concerns that were raised about the exemption of the compatibility duty during the parliamentary passage of the recent children withdrawal from religious education and the amendment to the UNCRC's compatibility duty in Scotland. So that feedback will sort of like inform our consideration of the scope of the proposed duties in the Human Rights Bill. And the bill, I suppose, provides us with that opportunity to consider, you know, just as you're saying, what alternative options may be available to ensure the best possible breadth of the duties while still meeting that central aim for a clear, accessible and navigable framework within the devolved competence. I hope that helps. So it is complex. There is no easy. I wish I could give you a one-liner answer, and there isn't one. I think it's a demonstration of the complexities of how it all sits together. But what I can give you, the assurance, is that all that work is being sort of like worked through at a detailed level with extensive engagement from stakeholders and experts in this space.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now questions from Maggie Chapman, please.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Minister. Thank you for joining us this morning and for what you've said so far. I've got a couple of questions on how you intend to use the high-level action plan. I recognise that it's high level from the get-go, but I suppose given some of the really quite significant and quite problematic areas of concern that the Scottish Human Rights Commission State of the Nation report published last year raises around, for example, food security, a housing crisis denying people access to safe, affordable, adequate housing. How do you see the high-level action plan actually helping you deliver those outcomes you were talking about, making it better for people across Scotland? Because I think there's a concern that there are a lot of very fine words in the action plan, but actually, how do we translate that into action on the ground? And I suppose I'm particularly interested in housing and homelessness, but there are issues across the board relating to poverty, relating to food inequality, and I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Yes, no, thank you for that, and thank you for acknowledging the sort of like the complexities around all of that and how wide-ranging it actually is. You know, it's cross-portfolio, cross-governmental, cross-legislation. So thank you for that. You know, the high-level action plan is the first of its kind in the UK, and I think, you know, I'll draw your attention to the word action, and I acknowledge, you know, that nobody wants just warm words, and that's why the word action, I'll emphasise that. So it systematically sets out what we are doing to further strengthen the implementation of rights in the areas that were raised by the UN's committee, including some of the ones that you've mentioned, but also fair work, social security, child poverty, education, cultural rights, and of course housing, as you've mentioned, Ms Chapman. So, you know, we're acknowledging that human rights are interrelated and interdependent. So the high-level action plan presents the strategic and coordinated actions that we will take across economic, social and cultural rights. Though, of course, you know, we need to unpack that further in relevant strategies and deliverable plans in place that are associated with those issues. So you know, there's many areas, but since you've raised housing, I can give a little bit further detail on that, if that's helpful. So with regards to housing access and affordability, the plan states our rights-based housing commitment, which includes an expansion of the affordable housing supply with the intention of a new housing agency with a focus on simplicity, on scale and speed, to enable the delivery of housing of all types, the prevention and reduction of homelessness through ongoing investment to prevent homelessness and rough sleeping, and that includes the £15 billion to councils to support a range of services, including that homelessness prevention in 2025-26, and of course that targeted support to address housing inequalities for priority groups, including the Coming Home programme, for instance, and improved outcomes for Gypsy traveller communities through the Gypsy Traveller Accommodation Fund. I can go into other areas should Ms Chapman wish.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I mean, we could go into a lot of the areas in quite a lot of detail, but I suppose you mentioned in that the need to have cross-governmental support, and I presume, we're not just talking about the Scottish Government, we're talking about local government, we're talking about that whole Scotland picture. One of the concerns that has been raised with us, and we've had a conversation in this committee already about it, is the other agencies that are required to act, to be able to act, to support, whether that's housing support and homelessness prevention, whether it's preventing child poverty, wherever we look. And I suppose I'm curious in your thinking around the ongoing sustainability of funds like the Equalities and Human Rights Fund that provide really crucial support to organisations across Scotland who do work really in communities, embedded in communities, and have phenomenal returns on investment, but are seeing that pot dwindle, I suppose is the easiest way of putting it.
Yeah, no, I do. I understand what you're asking about that. And I think, yet again, that exemplifies how wide-ranging it is. And so many people are involved in the delivery of this, which, again, I think supports our view of taking our time to work through it. Because what we ultimately end up with is something that we want to make sure is, people can realise their rights. That, that's the thing, is you can have rights, but the challenge is, and this committee has mentioned it before, is that you've got to be able to actually realise those rights as well. And that's where, I suppose, the extensive engagement, you've got to take people with you on that, not only the awareness raising, but I suppose the capacity building and capability building that has been going on throughout. And of course, sort of like, I've sort of said to this committee before about embedding that kind of human rights approach through everything we do. The mainstreaming toolkit, for instance, that has been sort of like one example, making sure that whilst we're undertaking this work, that doesn't take away from the fact that people, to have that sort of like culture of embedding human rights in the first place. It's not a new concept. We're all working towards the same goal within that. But I suppose that, your question sort of went further into recognising the work of the third sector and the essential and valued work that they do to deliver that support to people and communities as well. So I can assure you that they have a very strategic role in enabling that transformatory sort of that transformation and that delivery of personal-centred services. So with regards to funding, this year in 2026-27, the draft budget announced that the Scottish Government will invest £14.2 million in third sector infrastructure and development. And the latest estimate indicates that across government, we invested over £1 billion in the third sector in 2023. The sustainability of that, if Ms Chapman was sort of going towards that, how sustainable is it as we progress through our work regarding human rights? And multi-year funding is always sort of like asked for, and recognising that longer-term planning allows the development and the sustainability and security in doing that. So we are delivering against our commitment to develop a fairer funding approach by providing more multi-year funding to third sector organisations that are delivering those frontline services and tackling child poverty. As part of the 25-26 programme for government, we committed to delivering a fairer funding pilot that provides multi-year funding to third sector organisations, and it prioritises the ones that deliver the frontline services and tackling child poverty. So the pilot consists of 51 government grants to third sector organisations that total over 130 million over the 25-26 period and the 26-27. I hope that, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I suppose some of the questions that are coming back to us as we talk about this is, you know, when we know we've got community groups or organisations that are working across Scotland in communities, they've built relationships with communities, they are trusted maybe more than local authorities or national government projects or programmes might be. And one of the challenges is understanding that just because something's been around for a long time doesn't mean to say it needs to be replaced with something innovative. And one of the other challenges is recognising that those relationships that are built between local organisations and the communities they support can't be easily replicated. Once they've gone, they take a long time to rebuild, and there's concern that the current approach, and I mentioned that fund again, the Equalities and Human Rights Fund, the current approach of that will result in programmes and projects closing because they can't be sustained, and therefore having to start from scratch again to build those relationships, to build the trust upon which a lot of this equalities and human rights work relies on. And I suppose you've given a lot of information in your previous answer. I suppose it's really just, I'd like some acknowledgement from the Scottish Government that, you know, it's not just about the multiplicity of funds and multi-year funding. It's the sustainability of existing funding that's really, really important as well.
Yeah, no, I totally acknowledge that. I mean, you know, you're well aware that the Equality and Human Rights Fund supports those projects that are highly, highly valued, and you know they're tackling some of the most sort of systemic sort of like discrimination, prejudice, and some of the projects funded have that specific focus on community relations that you've mentioned as well. So it's sort of, I mean, the Scottish Government has provided a total of sort of like, you know, I think it's 36 sort of like £1 million. It's sort of like numbers that have lots of, so it's 36843,807 amount between 21 and 26. But an example of the, you know, accepting the sustainable funding and that multi-year funding, an example of that is the commitment to providing multi-year funding for disabled people's organisations, for instance. And that was funded through the EHRF. I mean, obviously that's subject to the bill passing. So I hope that that's an example of that commitment, that we are making progress in that area.
No, I appreciate that, but I think those who run the EHRF fund would say that they've actually seen a 25% cut because it's been flat cash and it's not reflected inflationary uplifts over the last 5 years. But I'll move on to my next sort of issue. And in your opening comments, you talked about the significant pressures that we faced, and you mentioned the divisive rhetoric. And I'm interested in what actions the Scottish Government, other than the anti-racism in education programme, what actions the Scottish Government is going to take to ensure that we are actually tackling anti-immigration, and racism that's happening on our streets right now.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, obviously, sort of like in response to the very concerning scenes and rhetoric, especially over the summer, I believe that the Scottish Government we took a very strong leadership role in that to make sure that we acknowledge the hard work that goes on at that grassroots level on bringing communities together to make sure that the sort of like the strong cohesive communities and the good work that has gone over the years, we've realised that that can actually be quite fragile, and to make sure that we invest in that and we protect in that. So I was able to sort of secure additional funding of I think it was about £300,000 that I was able to secure. And that money was specifically to be targeted at grassroots community organisations. And in order to make sure that that money didn't get caught up in, various sort of administrative things, we partnered up with the STV Children's Appeal, because they already have structures to do that. And actually just last week, I was up in Dundee, where I saw the impact of that fund, where they were bringing communities together, where they had safe spaces, where they could talk about the very real and legitimate concerns that they have, whether that's the continued cost of living crisis, whether it's, access to their day-to-day needs and services and things. So they could talk about that. Also, some organisations I know were investing in providing training to staff so that they were able to have de-escalation conversations. They were able to have conversations that dealt with misinformation, with disinformation as well, at that very much community level, so that we're actually reaching the people who are having those conversations.
Yeah. No, thanks, Minister, and sorry to interrupt you. I just want to focus in on that, because you talked about misinformation, disinformation. I've witnessed on the streets, both in Dundee and in Aberdeen, people being directly targeted because of the colour of their skin, because of their ethnicity, and because these incidents have happened at so-called protests, Police Scotland officers who witness it have done nothing about it. And I suppose one of my concerns is, you've got this high-level action plan, you've got arrangements in place, and I appreciate the community cohesion funding you were just talking about, but we need all bodies of the public sector. We need Police Scotland, we need other agencies to act, and I do have a concern that there isn't really the understanding of where protest actually moves into criminal behaviour, whether that's hate speech, whether that's inciting hatred, or it's just blatant racism. And we are not seeing our public agencies act in ways to de-escalate there and then. And I'm really concerned that that doesn't really seem to be captured by the conversation, and therefore we are not enabling people to express their social and economic rights.
Yeah, no, I mean, I fully acknowledge your concerns there, absolutely. Some of the scenes that we have seen, have been appalling. And whilst I would also, always uphold the right of protest, legitimate, peaceful protest, but there is absolutely no place for the incitement of any kind of hatred towards any kind of group in that sense.
So when it happens, what would you expect Police Scotland to do?
Right, well, I'm thinking I think might be I might bring Ellie in here on the human rights tracker tool, because I think that's where you're going with this, is how do we track that of like all the different organisations, how are they going to be enabled to fulfil their obligations? Ellie, are you able to, on the human rights tracker tool might be helpful.
Of course. I'll maybe just speak to the system level actions that the member's asking about there. reiterating what the Minister said. So in March, the Scottish Government will publish the 2026-2030 Anti-Racism Delivery Plan to accelerate targeted system-level actions. And a priority within that is embedding anti-racism across government through strengthened governance, shared accountability, and improved data, which is what the Minister's connecting there with the Human Rights Tracker tool. So as the Minister said, that tool will be launched on the 12th of March, and it will enable us to all have the ability to take more strategic and coordinated action and to really join the dots between these different repeat issues that come up, not just within the treaty that we're looking at today, but across international human rights treaties. So CERD will be one of the treaties that's covered within that human rights tracker. And in time, we will be able to monitor actions and outcomes related to the recommendations that come from those treaty bodies.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that that's coming in March, but I suppose that's not very much comfort to the people who week after week are exposed to racist hate speech and see no action happen. I think that's deeply concerning that despite all the rhetoric around no place for racism on our streets, we aren't actually seeing the action to back that up. But I'll leave it there, convener. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now move on to Rhoda Grant, please.
Thank you, convener. Can I ask what other actions the Scottish Government's taking to tackle violence against women beyond that's already in the high-level action plan?
Could you just repeat that for me? I didn't hear. Sorry, I am hard of hearing. Forgive me.
And I'm soft-spoken, so that probably isn't helping you any. So just asking what additional actions the Scottish Government are taking to tackle violence against women beyond that's in the high-level action plan.
Thank you very much. Yes. Well, I mean, I'll link it in together. So, I mean, we're absolutely committed to meeting the benchmark that has been set by the international treaties and obligations such as the Istanbul Convention. The final report from the group of experts on action against violence against women and domestic violence, also known as GRIVIO, that gave us an insight and key recommendations into how the Scottish Government is complying with the obligations arising from the Istanbul Convention. Now, that consisted of 90 recommendations. Many of them, of course, are UK-wide, with some directed at individual nations as well. And you'll be aware that they cover many areas, including health, education, the no recourse to public funds, data collection, and the criminal justice system. Our Equally Safe delivery plan contains an action to respond to the GRIVIO reporting process. And there is also a commitment to develop an action plan of how we will implement the Istanbul's Convention recommendations, and that, I think, is Action 13.2 within that. So we're currently working with internal and external partners in a concerted and comprehensive way to develop the GRIVIO action plan. And ahead of the election period, we intend to set our plans for the next phase of implementing the GRIVIO recommendations, including the key actions within the priority areas as well.
Okay. The Scottish Government recognises that prostitution is violence against women, but voted down the Unbuyable Bill in the Parliament recently, and I think part of the reason for that was the costs associated with providing support for women in prostitution and roots out. But if the Scottish Government already recognises that's violence against women, surely they must be providing support and roots out, regardless of whether this is in legislation or not.
I mean, I don't have the Equally Safe delivery plan right in front of me, but from what I can recall in my memory, there are specific actions that are related to that. I don't know whether I can bring Kevin in on that with, yeah.
In addition to that, so there's around 115
projects funded through the Delivering Equally Safe Fund through around 107 organisations, which supports 67,000 adults, children and young people. Some of those will be vulnerable women. So in regards to your specific question around supporting women through routes out of prostitution, we can come back to you with more definitive figures if that would help.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We now move on to questions from Tess White, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. My question is around the steps that will be taken to improve the availability of intersectional and disaggregated data, given that the gaps identified were quite significant by civil society organisations and the Scottish Human Rights Commission. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. So we have seen good overall progress. You know, we recognise the challenges, absolutely. We recognise that, I'm accepting that. But as I said, overall, we have seen good progress towards the aims of the 23-25 Equality Evidence Strategy, which is really important to get that evidence, right? So over the lifetime of that strategy, we have seen an increase in the availability of equality and intersectional data across a wide range of policy areas, including Social Security Scotland, for instance, transport, health, social care and education. We've also improved the accessibility of that equality evidence through updates to our Equality Evidence Finder, the publication of our 2023 Gender Equality Index, and producing a number of detailed quantitative and qualitative reports examining the lived experience of people across Scotland, including non-binary people and minority ethnic groups. We have shared this work alongside other examples of good practice in collecting, analysing and producing equality evidence both internally and externally. So there is an evaluation of the strategy that is now underway, and it is due for publication this spring. So that evaluation will provide an assessment of improvements to the equality evidence base and identify the areas for improvement to take forward as part of the next strategy. So we're not complacent. You know, I think it is important to recognise the progress that we have made, but I absolutely accept that we have much further to go.
Thank you, Minister. So at the start in your address, you talked about the 4 priorities, and one of the 4 is high quality, sustainable public services. That was, you know, one of the key areas and the goals to drive all actions. Data does matter, and the recording of data matters. So you've talked about non-binary people and gender equality index, but there are 4 protected characteristics of the 9 protected characteristics of the Equality Act: age, disability, sex and race. And if you look at the most discriminated against, you could say that age and disability. But when you look at public services, even the most basic, loos, libraries and leisure centres. Loos, there's still a urinary leash. In fact, local toilets and changing places are on the massive, massive decrease, and that's causing issue in rural areas. Libraries, 16% decrease in libraries. They provide not just a safe space for people to go to and access to IT, some warmth for people who need to go during the day. Libraries, massive decrease in libraries that was only brought up to the Culture Minister last week. And leisure centres, that the risk assessments are not taking place against the protected characteristics of age, disability, sex, and even race. So I suppose my question is, you're looking at data and collecting data on things that are not in the protected or not protected characteristics in the Equality Act. So if you can't get the base data, how can you actually build and create positive outcomes?
Okay, I don't understand your bit at the end about collecting data on not protected, because so like race is protected. I referred to that.
My point is, take 4 of the 9 protected characteristics: age, disability, sex, and race. If you would, if the public sector is actually collecting data on those 4 core characteristics, you wouldn't be facing, as you say, to use your language, systemic discrimination. So there is systemic discrimination. We just talked about sort of race. You could say race and religion is one of them that Maggie Chapman has raised. I'm adding to that age, disability and sex. So there's a massive disconnect with what the Scottish Government is measuring and reporting on. Non-binary is not a protected characteristic. Gender is not a protected characteristic. So if you can't manage what you don't measure. So my point is, why not go back to the 9 protected characteristics, look at age, look at disability, look at sex, and look at race, and actually say, for those basic services that we're providing, and looking at from an intersectional basis. Last week, this committee published a report on the huge issues to do with rural discrimination. You just have to look at maternity services in the Highlands and up in the northern end of Scotland. Women are being discriminated against there. Disability, we're not providing public sector loos. And so both women and women with disabilities and women of a certain age are being discriminated against. But the Scottish Government is not collecting the data and not requiring local government to collect the data. So how can you actually measure positive outcomes if you're not even looking at the basic data?
Right, so first of all, data is collected, right? So it's not, that isn't correct to say that data is not collected. Data is collected. With reference to sort of like the intersectionalities, and we've talked about this before, is that, you know, different protected characteristics are going to intersect and cause additional layers of discrimination depending on what they are. You know, for instance, if you're from an ethnic minority and you're a disabled person, for instance, you know, those additional layers. So whilst they are separate and come under separate protected characteristics, the inevitability of the fact that they are also intersecting as well. So you know, that is inevitable in that sense. I suppose I could give you an example on sort of like, you talked about disabled people and sort of gathering evidence and data on that. An example of that was in January, we published a comprehensive and intersectional evidence review of disabled people's experience in Scotland, delivering key actions from our Disability Equality Plan. Now, there were, you know, I mean, it was a difficult read. You know, there were things in that set out the stark reality and the intersectional barriers that disabled people are facing. For instance, if you're disabled and from the LGBT community, if you're from an ethnic minority. So all of these add on those layers. So for us, you know, it was really helpful to bring all that evidence together, and we are using that as sort of like to be central in informing future policies, because that ultimately, the need for data, it's not just about the numbers. We've talked about that before. How is it actually going to affect policy, and how is it going to affect people's outcomes and improve their life chances? So that will inform future policies, the priorities that we have to improve the lives of disabled people. And, you know, the publication of that also, it supports that wider commitment to sort of strengthening the use of the equality and the intersectional evidence from public and corporate design policy, monitoring and evaluation. And you're quite right to, you know, I mean, it's great that you're sort of like taking it down to the community levels and mentioning the things that you're mentioning. I can't remember off the top of my head, but from what I remember, there has been, I mean, we have expanded the fund to sort of like accessible toilets, for instance, the changing places toilets. I mean, there's been huge investments in that, and that has been welcomed. So there are specific outcomes that come out of those. Do you know what I mean? So if you're talking about, well, what's the purpose of the data? Are we collecting it? Yes, we are. Is it important? Yes, it is. Does it affect our policy decisions? Yes, it does. And the aim is to actually improve the lives. But that's where bringing it all back to the Human Rights Bill, I suppose it brings it all into that. So that kind of, you know, strengthening people's rights whilst laying the groundwork for that sort of like implementation for future human rights. Because, I mean, you know, it's everybody's right to be able to access a toilet. You know, of course it is. So, you know, the bills sort of enables that to happen, I suppose. But remember that we do have, you know, funding that goes with that as well. For instance, the improvement services, the NHS Education for Scotland, to strengthen everybody's knowledge and understanding. And yeah, I hope that's enough. Forgive me if I've gone off track a bit.
No, and I think in terms of the most basic, because there is a cross-party group on changing places, and very, very little progress has taken place. And yes, I acknowledge there is a fund, but if in local areas toilets and changing places are on the decrease, I mean, even when you're travelling, there's only one changing places toilet in Dundee Station. The rest of the North East, there isn't one on the line. So if you're a woman of let's say a 75-year-old woman who's got dementia, you can't go out your home because there's nowhere. And if you talk about the overlay of rurality, you're stuck at Lawrence Kirk Station. There's no loo. You don't know. You can't call. And I think in terms of the feedback is there is a huge disconnect of basic intersectional data on the protected characteristics. And then if you overlay what the Scottish Human Rights Commission have shared with us, and it's in our report, that intersectional age, disability, sex and race, then the data is not being collected on them. And then if you overlay rurality, there is a massive issue. So my final question, do you recognise that the basic data is not being collected across Scotland on those 4 protected characteristics, and then if you overlay rural, it's definitely not being collected?
No, I wouldn't go as far as sort of like that. You know, I mean, obviously you're going to put your question in sort of such stark terms. I would say that the answer to that is not a straightforward answer. I do believe that we are collecting that data. And I do acknowledge that there are complexities in bringing it together. We've talked before about the fact that sometimes the numbers are actually so small that they have to be statistically viable as well. So there are challenges around that. I think that the Equality Evidence Finder is a very, very useful tool. In maybe, can I maybe bring in? I can maybe bring in Kevin on that to
before, Minister, before
detail.
Kevin comes in. Yeah. So I've done FOIs on 160 public sector organisations. They cannot even define sex. Many of them cannot define sex. They collect data on gender. Some of them can't even give me an answer on what actions they have done against the 9 protected characteristics. One of them said, what do you mean by action? So I suppose my point is Scottish Government, 160 of them are not collecting basic data on those different protected characteristics. So how can you measure outcomes if you're not collecting the base data? And I have got the FOIs all back. I'm very happy to share with you. You would be shocked that they come back and they're not collecting the data on the 9 protected characteristics. They can't even, many of them can't even define the difference between sex and gender, and they don't know what an action is.
Well, the Human Rights Bill, I think, will enable and, focus everybody's minds on making sure that everybody's rights are realised. There is also the public sector equality duty. So actually all public, I would remind sort of like all organisations that they have a duty to be collecting data. That is appropriate in order to feed in to the policy. What is the aim? Why are we collecting that data? What is it we're trying to achieve? And to make sure that we do collect that data that is appropriate and fit for purpose. So I would be expecting that. I think, as I said, the evidence, the Equality Evidence Finder might be helpful to give the committee some more information.
I'll move on. Maybe we take that offline, because I would like to, would you meet with me where I can share with you the data that demonstrates that the public sector organisations are not collecting. So you can have all sorts of finders and, reports, but you're not collecting the base data. So will you meet with me? And I'll share that data with you.
Ms White, I'm always delighted to meet any colleague and any member of this committee.
Thank you. Back to you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. We now move on to questions from Paul McLennan, please.
My technical issues this morning. Minister, I don't know if you've maybe answered this in the time I was offline. One of the key issues I think it was raised in the recommendation was around about the issue of tackling the institutionalisation of people with learning disabilities. And of course there are many areas in that. I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. And my second question comes on a little bit as well, as in terms of, you mentioned obviously around about the high-level action plan and how we monitor it, and I suppose it's a little bit more on how we monitor it and report back, and kind of where you see the committee, this committee, being obviously holding government to account on that. Just a little bit more on that, if you don't mind, if that's okay.
I think I picked up most of the. Convener, can I just check with you that I got the main points of that question regarding people with learning disabilities? Was the first bit?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I didn't quite catch the second bit, but maybe you can come back in with a wee reminder for me. Thank you. Apologies. So I mentioned, I think, previously the Coming Home agenda. So I just want to reiterate that the Scottish Government is committed to the Coming Home agenda, and we accept that it's completely unacceptable that people are spending time in hospitals or other care settings when they are medically fit for discharge. And for every day that they spend in hospital that's unnecessary, we know that people are losing a part of their connection with their community, their family and their friends. So the Scottish Government provided over £20 million of funding to integration authorities through the Community Living Change Fund and, of course, other funding. So this has had real impacts in terms of supporting people to move into the community. And at the moment, we're taking a final review of the impact of this funding, of course. We want to make sure that it is, in fact, having the impact that we want it to have. So the Scottish Government and COSLA jointly established a Coming Home Senior Strategy Group to oversee that implementation of the Coming Home implementation report. And they delivered the Dynamic Support Register, which was launched in May 2023. So that improves the visibility of people with learning disabilities and complex care needs at local and national levels. It provides a tool to support local planning decision making. And the most recent quarterly Dynamic Support Register data that took us up to September 2025 shows that fewer people delayed in hospital or inappropriate care out of area inappropriate placings out of area compared to last year. So that has had an impact. There's also a peer support network that brings together learning disability professionals from across Scotland to share best practice and to get support with planning services for individuals with particularly complex needs. And the initial thinking on a national support panel to improve support and accountability, and of course to hear from families and individuals about their individual circumstances. The consultation on the LDAN bill set out the 3 options around the scope and the remit of this panel, and further work has taken place to develop these options. I can provide further information, and I'm happy to be reminded. I'd be grateful for a reminder of the second part of your question.
Thanks, Minister. I don't know if I'm having connection problems. My apologies. The second part, Minister, was around about the monitoring and reports in high-level action plan. And you talked around about, obviously, the monitoring of that, but I suppose it's reporting back on that. And I suppose the key thing, I think, for me, obviously, that these actions go across a number of portfolios. Yeah. And I suppose it's how you report, and we'll get the report back. But in terms of how do you intend to then look at the other actions in the portfolios to make sure that's taken right across all portfolios and not just this one, because it obviously impacts on other ones as well. So your thoughts on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so, you know, obviously it's the ultimate aim that the content of the high-level action plan can be integrated into the forthcoming human rights tracker, which will in time support us to report on those actions and outcomes, both domestic and international committees. And as I said in my opening remarks, I'll launch the tracker on the 12th of March, and you know, we've given an invitation to the clerks, which I think has been taken up. But, you know, it would be very helpful for committee members to sort of have a look at it, and then you can get a practical insight into what it looks like, what it feels like, and how effective it is. So the invitation through the convener is there. So that the intent of that tool is to help improve that transparency and to enhance the implementation efforts and on the recommendations we receive from the human rights treaty bodies. So the first phase of that is an accessible database of recommendations with the aim of further enabling us all to take strategic and coordinated action in devolved areas. So our intention also is that the national human rights institutions, the Scottish Parliament, civil society, the rights-based holders will be better able to review the recommendations and ultimately scrutinise the actions taken and the outcomes achieved via the tracker. So, as I've said, you know, this committee plays a critical role in human rights scrutiny. So I would encourage you to, you know, attend and have a look at the tracker. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Minister. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, thank you. And finally, we have questions from Marie McNair, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister and your officials. Obviously, I want to touch on the human rights budgeting. Is there anything else you kind of want to say on that in terms of human rights budgeting? And are you aware of any additional work that the Scottish Government are doing, you know, to ensure that further budgets comply with the international covenant?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, you know, we were able to, it was great that the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and I, you know, we were here very recently. I think it was the last appearance, yeah. And we spoke extensively to the committee about the improvements to the budget process and the use of human rights budgeting principles remain part of the budget process. We have made continuous progress in recent years, and of course we're exploring how best to make more ambitious changes in future years, being mindful of the ISCAR and the equality obligations. So one of the main additions to the strategic impact, integrated impact assessment, the SIA, has been to integrate the detailed assessment of child rights and well-being under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child requirements, as was incorporated into Scots law. So our detailed analysis concluded that the substantial investment in the child poverty package and the spending that benefits all children is likely to be positive for child's rights, in particular the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to the highest attainable standard of healthcare, and the right to an education, of course. And I do know that, Spice did note in their blog that this approach may give an indication as to the opportunities which may arise should the government achieve its intention to further embed human and social rights in Scots law. So I think that is an acknowledgement that we are absolutely, moving in that right direction. So I suppose, the evidence on how portfolios contribute to human rights was collected as part of that SIA process. But in the interests of developing a streamlined and more accessible document, we decided not to publish those because, again, it's all about actions, and the documents that we published alongside the budget process, how valuable are they? How accessible are they? What are the ones that are used most meaningfully? Right? So we want to make sure that we do that. And just as a last thing, the pilot work that we've done on budget tagging, that may also provide opportunities to support human rights budgeting in the future. And our planned evaluation of that work that we've done for this budget will help us to understand better what might be the best ways to take things further. And I've already committed to share that work with the committee, as always. I hope that's helpful.
Sure. Obviously, you spoke about the importance of embedding, human rights approach into and across the public sector. What resources will be required to achieve that kind of cultural change?
Well, I suppose it's resources, but it's also cultural change is mindset, isn't it? And I just think that when it comes to human rights, if we start with that premise that human rights are for everybody, and by very virtue of being a human, you are entitled to those basic rights. So if we start with that aim, then whatever else we do on top of that, we need to keep that aim in mind, right? So I suppose what we need to do to back that up is not only take people with us and make sure that they have plenty of time for that development of understanding. And a lot I have to say, a lot of work good work has gone on that. And I think that I have already mentioned to the committee the mainstreaming work that, I've undertaken this year. And we launched the mainstreaming suite because it is a suite of resources. That was on December the 8th. And that included a strategy, but also a groundbreaking toolkit and the action plan. So together, that lays the best conditions to embed that human rights culture. Now, I believe that the strategy provides that clear vision and framework to making a change on how we develop policies. And how we deliver services and allocate resources. So, but on a technical level, the action plan did in fact bring together 61 of our actions, which align to the 6 key drivers that are outlined in the strategy. And of course, it focuses on Scottish Government actions, of course. So it's bringing together all the different resources that are accessible, that are comprehensive, to make sure that you know, we move towards that. So I suppose I can't give you exact examples of the resources because there's over 100 of them already that are available, and it's capacity building, it's evolving. So as we discover more resources that are helpful, it will add to that bank of resources. So it's laying the best possible conditions to make sure that we're all committed to moving forward on a human rights agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with you there. It's not all down to budgets. It's about, you know, that change in mindset, and just it could be just a policy change, do you mean, that brings about that, you know, that change that's required. So thanks for that. Cheers.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. That brings our agenda item to a close. And want to thank the Minister and her officials once again for joining us this morning. We will suspend briefly for a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. Welcome back. We will now move on to our next agenda item, which is our final evidence session as part of our inquiry into neurodivergence in Scotland. I therefore welcome to the meeting Tom Arthur, Minister for Social Care and Mental Wellbeing. The Minister is accompanied by Georgia De Courcy-Wheeler, CAMS and ND Improvement Team Leader, Scottish Government's Mental Health Directorate, and Robbie Steele, Principal Medical Officer for Mental Health, also from the Scottish Government's Mental Health Directorate. You're all very welcome and thank you for joining us this morning. I refer members to papers 4 and 5 and I invite the Minister to make an opening statement. Minister.
Good morning, Convener, and thank you to you and to the committee for the opportunity to contribute towards this important inquiry. I very much welcome the committee's focus on the lived experience of neurodivergent people in education, criminal justice and the workplace, areas that have a profound influence on opportunity, well-being and future stability. Neurodivergence is a natural and valuable part of human diversity. Neurodivergent people contribute talent, creativity and insight across our society. But we must also recognise that many of our systems were not designed with different ways of thinking, communicating and processing information in mind. In a world not always built for them, everyday interactions can become barriers. This is why building a more neuroaffirming society must sit alongside ensuring access to effective neurodevelopmental support. Valuing difference does not remove the need for timely, practical help when it is required. Demand for support and diagnosis continue to rise. While increased awareness is welcome, it has placed pressure on services. A model centred solely on diagnosis and waiting lists is not sufficient. What makes the greatest difference is coordinated, needs-based support, often small, proportionate adjustments that can have a significant impact on someone's confidence, stability and ability to participate fully. Effective support must be whole system, holistic and multi-agency. It spans health, education, justice, employability and community services, including vital input from the third sector, and must adapt as people's needs change across their life. Many of these themes were explored during the Health, Social Care and Sports Committee's inquiry, which reported earlier this month. And I have also considered many of these issues with a cross-party group of MSPs and experts at our Neurodivergence Summit at the end of last year, with a follow-up to that summit set to take place next week. From all of this work, it is clear that the shared challenge is to ensure that systems recognise difference, respond proportionately, and adapt as people's needs change over time. As I said, often it is relatively small, practical adjustments made at the right moment that can have a significant and lasting impact on someone's ability to participate and to thrive. With that, Convener, I will conclude and very much look forward to the discussion ahead.
Okay, thank you, Minister. We will now move on to members' questions, and I'm going to kick us off firstly asking what concrete actions does the Scottish Government intend to take to ensure that there is a functioning, consistent neurodevelopmental assessment pathway available to people across Scotland?
I appreciate this is an area of significant interest to the committee, particularly given the evidence that I know you've taken over recent weeks. Similarly, it was obviously an area of significant interest to the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee. I think I'd point to two pieces of work that have been undertaken. For children and young people, you will be aware of the neurodevelopmental specification, and subsequent to that, the review and the cross-sector task force which was established and indeed has now been meeting. In addition to that, that has been supported with resource as well, and there is further resource that was announced both for this financial year and indeed within the budget going through Parliament for the coming financial year. So touching on children and young people, the task force is co-chaired. It has representation from health and education, reflecting that need for a holistic cross-sector approach. And that will be working to improve the development of the specification, recognising that many instances of a neurodevelopmental condition may be first identified and present within an educational setting. With regards to adults, there is a work that we do through funding the National Autism Implementation Team, and they have been working with health boards to develop pathways and to work with the government as well in engaging with health boards to improve consistency, recognising that there is variance that exists, but also recognising the need to move forward and to ensure that there is equity of access and support right across Scotland. I maybe ask George if she wants to come in at this point, maybe just to provide a wee bit more detail on some of the work we've been doing around pathways, both for children and young people and adults.
Thank you, Minister.
Yes, so as the Minister said, in the children and young people space, we have had the neurodevelopmental specification for a number of years. Last year, we did an implementation review which set out a range of actions to support health boards, education and a cross-sector view of implementing that specification. The cross-sector task force the Minister mentioned is playing a really important role in supporting both the Scottish Government and COSLA in taking forward those actions, all of which aimed at progressing implementation of the specification. That specification applies across all of Scotland. So progressing its implementation will help us having a more consistent and appropriate pathways for children and young people, recognising the need for local delivery whilst there's that national leadership and guidance. In the adult neurodevelopmental space, we've been working with NATE again for a number of years now to support health boards in developing their services and pathways. That work, I think it's fair for us to say, is less well developed than in the children and young people space, but something we're really committed to driving forward in the next few years.
Okay, thank you. How will the new £7.5 million funding for neurodevelopmental assessments reduce waiting times, and when do you think you can see those measurable improvements?
One of the things I would want to highlight really at the outset of this session is I very much recognise the importance that is placed upon assessment and diagnosis, both in relation to questions around identity and validation. Also, specifically in the case of ADHD, where in some cases it is required to ensure that the most appropriate treatment can be provided, specifically medication. I also recognise that the committee will have heard evidence that, and I'm sure we'll touch upon this in more detail, is that where we do have a system that is in principle based upon need, that there are many who feel that without a assessment and diagnosis, it is more difficult to access support. And I'm conscious that that in itself then leads to greater pressure and focus placed upon the question of assessment and diagnosis. What I want to be clear is in recognising that and in no way seeking to not fully appreciate the significance and the importance that is placed upon assessment and diagnosis, as I know the committee has heard, and as I touched on in my opening remark, that diagnosis is not a requirement to access support. And often it can be the case is that very small interventions at the right time can have the most profound impact in improving an individual's well-being. So when thinking about how we utilise the resource at our disposal, it has to be applied in a way that is consistent in meeting and consistent with that needs-based approach, so that we can ensure we are meeting everyone who has a need, recognising as well that there will be individuals who do not meet diagnostic thresholds but who still have a need that must be addressed and support that is required. So just in terms of the sort of principles around how we're looking at resourcing and funding overall, I want to be clear that we want to be consistent with that principle of a needs-based approach. But with maybe some more detail in terms of how funding is being utilised at the moment, I'll ask Georgia to come in.
Thanks, Minister. Thank you. And committee will be aware that that £7.6 million in the draft budget for next financial year is earmarked for young people. So I can give a little bit of a flavour of where we're at with our thinking on that. So as Minister said, at the moment, our focus is around that whole system needs-based support approach, and we're very much guided by the neurodevelopmental specification. We are working through with our partners at COSLA how that funding could be best utilised to deliver the biggest impact and change for neurodivergent children and young people and their families. It will, of course, be also for the next government to consider how to take that forward. But I would like to just state at this point that in doing that thinking and that work with COSLA, we are making sure that we
listen to the voices of lived experience, as well as professions across psychiatry, psychology, and the third sector, and also our education colleagues in guiding how we might use that additional investment, and very much with that long-term sustainable change in mind that we know that we need to see for neurodivergent people. Minister mentioned that we have also given additional funding in this financial year, and that very much builds on some of the smaller funding we've been able to do over the previous few years, expanding on some of the work we've done, testing digital assessment tools. We're now expanding that to work with all health boards to work on their existing waiting lists to support how to help them identify the support needs of the people on their waiting lists at an earlier opportunity. That digital tool is still in a testing phase, but we're helping that work progress. We've also provided some additional funding this year to increase capacity in health boards for assessment and diagnosis for their over 16s, recognising that this is a one-off investment, but there is an age group that is at risk of ageing out of services. So whilst that diagnostic focus isn't the whole of our policy approach, we recognise that there was a valid use of that funding at a point in time to kind of alleviate some of the pressure in the system at that point. We've also invested some of our additional funding into testing of digital support for young adults, so people at that kind of transition stage, having left school and moving into further and higher education, recognising again that this can be a particularly challenging point in people's lives, those transition stages. And we have also provided some additional investment in family support. Again, something that came through our review work with COSLA was the huge value that third sector provision can give in terms of family support and really empowering parents to support their children. So our funding going forward into the next year, we're really looking at how we use that to build on all the learning we've been able to do through the investments made up till this point and make that more long-term and sustainable, as I said.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for that feedback. That's really helpful. We now have questions from Maggie Chapman, please.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, Minister. Thank you for joining us this morning. Really, my first question will just build on that, on your answer and George's contributions as well. When you're talking about the broader sort of needs-based support, so not requiring a diagnosis but ensuring people have access to the support, you've talked about tools, you've talked about digital support, family support. What specific steps is the Scottish Government taking to ensure people who need those support mechanisms actually firstly know about them and can access them? It's not always about funding. Obviously funding, especially if they're third sector organisations providing them, that's crucial, but it's not always about funding. What's the Scottish Government doing beyond funding to ensure people have access to the support that's out there without diagnosis?
Thank Ms Chapman for her question. It's a very important one. I think it gets to the point of providing services and investing to ensure that services are available is one thing, but ensuring that people are aware of it and know to access it is another entirely. I think there's been work in recent years around raising awareness. There was a number of years ago there was the Different Minds campaign. I think there's certainly a recognition that there's more we have to do in increasing awareness of the range of services that are available. One point I would also observe, and the committee will be very au fait with this, is the proliferation of resources that are now available online. Now, some, of course, will be from reputable sources and can be of use. Others, I think we would recognise, are potentially more concerning in terms of some of the information that may be provided. So ensuring that there's clear and accessible publicly provided information, signposting to services, is going to be a key focus of the government going forward, so that the investment that is being made to expand the provision of services is, of course, complemented by that signposting and awareness raising. I don't know if there's anything you want to add specifically, George, about some of the work in that space.
Yes, happy to. I think as the Minister said, it requires a two-track approach almost. On the one hand, we need to ensure that the resources and information and services that are available to parents, families are reliable, good, available. And then the second track is to make sure that they are aware of them. We have some work ongoing with the Neurodevelopmental Task Force to look at how we improve the shared knowledge base, particularly among kind of professional groups, whether that be in education, health, or the third sector, about the wide variety of resources that are available. And as the Minister said, I think it's something we acknowledge that there needs to be more and continuous work on.
Okay, thank you. Minister, if I can just go back to the questions around diagnostic assessments and the different pathways. Now, obviously, we understand, you know, the points made about diagnosis should not be necessary to get support, but quite often people find that without that duty to support, to make reasonable adjustments, that kind of thing that a diagnosis brings, they can't access that support. But so in terms of diagnosis, what is the Scottish Government doing to ensure that there is actually the ability for people to get a diagnosis wherever in Scotland they live? Because at the moment we know some health boards have just stopped that diagnostic pathway completely.
Yeah, I would go back to the points I made earlier with regards to the work with NATE and the recommendations that we have brought forward and that we are engaged in taking forward across health boards. But I think it may be useful just on the sort of broader question of diagnosis and the important role that it can play is maybe to invite Robbie to offer a few thoughts and reflections in that space.
Yeah, diagnosis in the whole of medicine is a bit more complicated than it's often portrayed. For example, your GP might tell you you've got hypertension. Well, that cut-off of where your blood pressure has to be and how often it needs to be checked to confirm that that's a true reading, etc., is inherently arbitrary. There's no risk curve in medicine that has a sudden step at the cut-off for hypertension. You know, your risk of heart disease, etc., and stroke follows a continuum. And similarly with neurodevelopmental disorders, which side of a line you fall on, whether you fit the diagnosis or don't fit the diagnosis, doesn't necessarily tell us what your needs are going to be, what's going to help. So I think in health boards, as a psychiatrist, I would say we need to be robust about the mechanisms that we use, the clinical mechanisms we use for confirming or refuting a diagnosis. But assessment is much broader than diagnosis. Assessment is assessment of needs, of educational needs. And the thing that might be causing the person the biggest problem in their life may actually not be the thing that they fulfill the diagnostic criteria for, if they do fill the diagnostic criteria at all. So I think we need a more good access to more holistic assessment that probably will also act as a triage to accessing clinical assessment if your profile suggests that you might fulfill the diagnostic criteria. So I think we need to, you don't have a right to a diagnosis, you probably should have a right to an assessment to see if you fulfill the diagnosis, but we need to stick with what the diagnoses are, which is very... The problem that Scotland is facing is the problem that all countries in the Western world are facing, which is the sudden increase in awareness of these difficulties has led to demand for assessment that is new and is common across the Western world. And I don't think any country has yet cracked it, with the result that all countries have a huge pent-up demand of people requesting assessment that they've not quite figured out how to meet. And in our system, it's ended up with NHS waiting lists, whether we need a different paradigm for looking at it and allowing people to access assessments and reserving the NHS for those who have a profile that suggests they need a full clinical assessment might be the way forward. That's something we're looking at, but I think it's caught all Western countries a bit on the hop. The systems that are designed for 1 or 2% of the population are being, are the obvious pathways to provide assessments for 20% of the population, and it's not going to fit, and they're struggling as a result. We've not yet come up with a really good solution that is person-based and puts diagnosis in its place, but offers assessments all around. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that is helpful. I suppose just a quick follow-up on that. Could one of the things that we change be that if people decide that they want to get a diagnosis privately, they go private, but they find then that diagnosis isn't recognised by the NHS, either for medication, if that's the appropriate route, or for other things. Is there a simple, quick fix that we can implement to ensure that a diagnosis, wherever it comes from, can be recognised and so be the gateway to further support, whether that's medication or other support?
This was raised at the cross-party summit, and as a psychiatrist, I'd say it is fundamentally a political judgment, because it's about equity of access to NHS services. The argument being, well, those who can afford a private assessment get the opportunity to jump the queue, and the strain of the shared care protocol. Say medication for ADHD. Once you're prescribed it, your blood pressure needs to be monitored. There needs to be a repeated assessment to see if you are still benefiting from it, or if it's causing more harm than good, particularly in children where it has an effect on growth potential. If you have people who can afford the private assessment jumping into that limited resource of follow-up, you can inadvertently end up blocking out those who can't afford it. I mean, you're a politician. I'm not. Where that is going to end up, I suspect private assessments will have a role, as they do in physical health, ultimately in dealing with this bulge in demand until it's through. But ultimately, we probably need a system that has the capacity to meet the need.
I think I'm happy to come back on that as well, just given I am the politician sitting at the end of this end of the table. I think there's obviously a point that the committee will be familiar with as well from the evidence that's taken, and I imagine from much of your own casework, which is around assurance of any assessments that are undertaking out with the NHS. I know you had consideration of the concerns around single condition assessments, and I think there was some discussion of that in the session with the Royal College of Psychiatrists last month. So there's clearly a matter here about ensuring that any process is robust, but I would want to provide the committee with reassurance that this is something that has been regularly raised with ministers. As Robbie said, it did feature as part of the deliberations in the cross-party summit, and it is something that we are giving broader consideration to. Clearly, there are questions that have been raised around equity of access, and there's also that point around the ongoing need for monitoring in the case where medication is prescribed. It's a challenging and it's a complex area. There's practical considerations about how any such process could be administered, and there's also, of course, these political considerations as well around equity of access. So what I cannot offer the committee a definitive answer at this session. I would say that I'll be very keen to consider the committee's reflections when it publishes its report. I think the committee can play a really important role in considering these questions and feeding into the work that's been undertaken by the Health Committee, and indeed the work that's underway through the cross-party summit.
Great. Thanks, Minister. And I share the point, I think Robbie's last point about we want to get to a point where actually we've got capacity within the NHS to deal with what we need to deal with. My final point, just going back to something you said earlier, Minister, when you were talking about the a holistic cross-sectoral approach for children and young people, the National Autism Implementation Team for adults. Are you confident that the Scottish Government has the right steps in place to ensure that post-diagnostic support is consistent across Scotland? Because we know that consistency is an issue, but are you confident that those two approaches will deliver that?
I think in terms of principle and policy, yes, of course, the challenge is one around implementation. So considering the new developmental specification for children and young people, that goes back a number of years, but we had that specific joint review with COSLA on implementation, which led to the task force. So that in itself concedes the point that there have been challenges around implementation. Recognising the unprecedented, and indeed this has been conveyed to the committee, unforeseen increase in demand. But from a policy perspective, and of course what sits with regards to the duties that are placed upon education authorities around ASN, ASL as well, yes, the challenge of course is around implementation, which is exactly why we established this cross-sector task force, bringing as it does together both health and education.
Okay, thanks Minister. I'll leave it there, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to move on to questions from Marie McNair before Paul McLennan.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister and your officials. Can I go back to Maggie's point and your earlier point there about not needing a diagnosis to access support? Unfortunately, we've heard during the evidence session and from feedback from own constituents that the reality on the ground is through maybe regional variations that folk are experiencing barriers to support without that diagnosis. And also your point there, I don't really agree. It's kind of jumping the queue. I think it's accepting that diagnosis that might have been done by a private psychiatrist that earlier on that week might have been practising as an HS psychiatrist. So surely, you know, it would help with waiting times, you know, and the impact that it has, the weight has on people's mental health. So sorry, it's just a few kind of comments there, but I just thought I had to make them. Do you know what I mean?
Sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, no, you go.
No, I think that they're very important points. I would just touch on and maybe ask Robert to come in a moment. Just reiterate that point. Of course, a situation where there is an assessment and diagnosis undertaken by someone in a private capacity who also works within the NHS will naturally lead to the kind of questions that you very reasonably put forward, Ms McNair. But I would also just offer that balancing point about where assessments perhaps are not undertaken in a way that we would regard as robust and can't provide that assurance. And again, the importance of ensuring that when assessments are undertaken, they are holistic and rounded and considering the full range of potential issues or challenges or conditions or circumstances that pertain to that individual, which obviously Robbie can speak to in a professional capacity, and just that we are in a position where we have assurance there. I think it might have been in taking evidence from the Royal College of Psychiatrists that the expression was used, maybe a rather blunt expression, but if the only tool you have is a hammer, then so that's important around any risk around single condition assessment. And that's not to recognise, just to reiterate the point that you make, that there will be those who are undertaking assessments in a private capacity who also work within the health, within the NHS. Again, it's I'm conscious of a range of views as regards to what the degree of utilisation of private capacity should be right across healthcare. Clearly, there are very strong principles where there's a broad political consensus and what the government's absolutely committed to, which is an NHS free at the point of use. But it has been raised, the issue of utilisation of private capacity. There are those who advocate it as on the basis of it being a practical and pragmatic use of the capacity that is there. There are others who will raise what I think are fair and legitimate concerns around equity and fairness within the system, and also that it's not always entirely as straightforward as simply of the question of having an assessment and diagnosis out with the NHS, but it's that ongoing care and ongoing support that is required beyond that. So I would just want to add these nuances of complexity, but that is in no way to dismiss what has been brought forward. I recognise it as a view that is widely shared, and I'd want to provide again and reiterate that point of assurance to the committee that it is something that we're engaging seriously on, but recognising that they are challenges, and particularly around what are described as shared care, but are technically voluntary arrangements. The principle of the decisions of the lead clinician or the GP around whether or not to enter into any such agreement, and it not being for ministers to seek to in any way interfere clinically in that regard. But I'm conscious of the calls that have been made to government for greater clarity around policy and consistency as well. So it's a complex area we're giving serious consideration to. I would want to provide the committee with that assurance. But I don't know if there's anything further you'd want to add, Robbie, in response.
Yeah, the issue of quality assuring private assessments, and you've given the undeniable example of a very high quality private assessment. The issue is then with shared care, which is that GPs, particularly with prescribing, are expected or are asked to prescribe this medication that they're not experts in. They want, understandably, the clinical reassurance that if they request a specialist review, does this person still need the medicine, were the correct assessments made of their physical health before they started it, etc. That's easy, or that can be arranged through a shared care arrangement with the specialist provision in your health board. It's much more difficult to get that agreement with a private provider, and that's been the sticking block traditionally. I don't think it's impossible, and as I say, I can see a situation where the extra capacity in the private sector is used to get us through the pent-up demand. But I think the problems with it in the long term are difficult, and that's not unique to mental health either.
Yeah, I'm reassured for myself and for my constituents that it is being considered. So we'll kind of wait and see where we go with that. Just finally, what actions are the Scottish Government taking to identify the most persistent barriers and forms of discrimination faced by neurodivergent people, and how will you ensure that the actions taken will lead to improvements?
Well, I've always sought to make clear is that government ministers hugely value the contribution of lived experience, and I recognise the committee does as well as part of your evidence sessions, having the round table. Many of the individuals that you heard from and the organisations that represent at your round table have been organisations which I personally and colleagues in government and officials have had engagement with on multiple occasions, and hugely value those insights. So I'd want to assure you, in terms of our policy development and how we go around implementation, taking on board and responding to the expertise that is provided through lived experience is of utmost importance to us, so that we can ensure that in terms of the actions that we are taking are consistent with our values of inclusion and equality. I'll maybe ask Georgia to come in a moment with some specifics, but the other broader point I would want to highlight, of course, is that while naturally we will focus upon systems, this is also a societal issue, and that is, of course, a much bigger challenge, given the effort and the concerted effort over a sustained period to effect cultural change. But it is something which I think is going to be of the utmost importance. It is not simply a whole systems approach, but a whole society approach as well. And recognising, as I sought to in my opening remarks, that we still have a world that is perhaps characterised by the norms and approaches relevant to neurotypical people, but often disregard the way in which neurodivergent individuals experience the world. And that is something that we have to address. We recognise the significant progress that has been made over years and decades by taking a social model approach, for example, around physical disability. You know, the barrier to someone being able to enter, for example, a public building or a theatre is not because they use a wheelchair, it's because there is not a ramp and sufficient, you know, equipment to allow them to fully participate. So that approach of a social model which has been so influential, and recognising there is still much work to be done and much progress still to be made, we can recognise the positive impact that that has had, and that it is possible to effect societal change and to raise standards and expectations about inclusivity within society, ensuring everyone has an opportunity to fully participate and realise their rights. That also, of course, has to apply in having a whole society approach to responding to the significant number of people who are seeking neurodevelopmental assessment and support, but recognising that these individuals have always been here. What's happening now is many of them, through greater awareness and in the tireless campaigning of many of these lived experience organisations who you took evidence from, and I've had the privilege of meeting, they have helped to ensure that a community is now finding a voice, and in doing so helping to effect change, both at the systems level, but also culturally and societally. But in terms of our engagement around issues around tackling discrimination and promoting a more equitable and equal society, I don't know if there's any reflections that you would want to add, Georgia.
Yeah, I'd love to share with the committee a really specific example where a lived experience organisation, who actually this committee has heard evidence from, we have regular engagement with, they brought to the policy officials' attention that there was a piece of Scottish Government guidance relating to the blue badge risk in traffic that cut across our aims of diagnosis not being a barrier to support. The Transport Scotland guidance for the blue badge had in it a recommendation to the local authorities to look for a diagnosis or evidence of a diagnosis forthcoming when assessing somebody for whether they were eligible for a blue badge risk in traffic. This wasn't something the policy team were aware of prior to it being raised with us by this lived experience organisation. So a really great example of how important that engagement is for us. And we were able to work with our colleagues over in Transport Scotland to have that guidance revised. And the guidance that's now produced by Transport Scotland for local authorities on those blue badges no longer includes that requirement. So that's a real specific example of something being brought to us by lived experience, of a real barrier to them, and something where we were misaligned within our own approaches, and we were able to address that.
I could sort of bring to you other examples of barriers to blue badges from neurodivergent people as well. So I'm quite happy to come back to you with that one. And I totally agree with your comments there about societal change. Absolutely.
Thank you. Now questions from Paul McLennan, please.
Convener, and thank you, Minister. I suppose there's a few key questions for me, and again, this is coming back to the shared protocol. I think this is really important. The equity of access, I think, has been mentioned, and I think it's equity access, I think, across both private and obviously the National Health Service, but also across different parts of Scotland, and we've heard that in various sessions around about that equality of access across different parts of Scotland. So I suppose the first question would be on what can we do to ensure that that's the case, because I think that's the key fundamental is about the shared care protocol and what can be done. The second part of that as well is maybe moving on from more the diagnosis in terms of who provides support. And I have a situation in my own constituency where we were talking to speech and language therapists, and the local authority aren't letting them operate in the local authority. Now, these are children who have had these speech and language therapists for a number of years, and they're not allowed access into the schools. And they're kind of saying, look, there should be there should be already support there. The support there that's provided isn't enough to ensure these kids are picked up. So it's based on equity of access across the country, but also in terms of how do we ensure that private speech therapists who have been working with kids over a long number of years aren't allowed access into the local authority now, and how do we make sure that again, that equity of access to the support that's there, it kind of goes ahead. And I've got a few other questions after that, but just that's the first one, Minister, if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr McLaren. On that specific instance, I would very much appreciate if you would write to me to furnish me with more of the details of it and give an undertaking to respond to you personally and to investigate. Of course, recognising the autonomy of the local authorities as education authorities, but we just want to understand the particular factors at play there. Certainly around seeking to drive greater consistency across Scotland for children and young people. We've already spoken at some length about the work of the implementation review, the national specification and the task force which has been taken forward, and indeed that is a co-chaired task force with representation from education and health, recognising that need for that rounded cross-sectoral working. On the principles around voluntary arrangements or shared care arrangements, I would want to provide assurance that we are, in terms of our considerations around that, will be in terms of that there would be an equity of approach across Scotland. I've certainly, since coming to post, sought to meet with as many of the health boards directly with the senior leadership, the chief executives there, and at each and every one of those meetings I have specifically raised the issue and discussed what provisions are in place around neurodevelopmental support and assessment, recognising that there is variation in approach and practice. Of course, there will be instances where there's innovation in practice, where there can be learning that can be shared and disseminated more widely, and that is something we want to assure happens. But I would just want to provide the assurance that in terms of seeking to ensure that there's equity and there's consistency of approach across Scotland, whether that's for children or young people or indeed for adults, that is a key consideration, because it is something that is relayed to me routinely, whether it be from correspondence from elected members or directly from members of the public or organisations representing individuals. So I'd want to provide that assurance to the member.
No, thank you, Minister. I think that the shared care work that you mentioned going on, I think it will be fundamental, and I look forward to receiving an update on that. I want to move on to a slightly different question. You mentioned obviously around about the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and I met with them individually, and we obviously had an evidence session with them, and they talk around about obviously national guidelines on working conditions and reasonable adjustments for schools, higher educational institutes and employers. So really just to get your thoughts on in terms of that, because obviously they pushed the whole cross-sectional kind of approach to that. And one other key question I think I mentioned this last week in evidence that we had was around about when it comes down to neurodivergent in training, lead training for teachers, it can vary within schools, never mind within local authorities, it can vary within individual schools. And I think that was an issue that was picked up by one of the groups that were in last week, saying it depends if the teachers are training or not. So your thoughts on how we can increase that training for neurodivergency, I suppose recognition, and in terms of looking at reasonable adjustments, particularly in schools.
On the question with regards to the report by the Royal College, I attended the event in Parliament launch. I've met with the Royal College and representatives on multiple occasions, and I responded to a members' debate. I think it was in the name of Daniel Johnson. I think, if I remember correctly, I may even responded to a question in Parliament in the chamber from yourself, Mr McLaren. And I would just take this opportunity to reiterate my sincere gratitude to the Royal College for the report that they have produced, which I think very much aligns with the work that the government has been undertaking over a number of years, recognising, as I touched on earlier, not just a whole systems but a whole society approach, and also, as they point out, recognising not just the unprecedented but the unforeseen increase in demand, and this is something that can be characterised as a wicked problem, recognising the complexity, and always I think is implicit within that is a caution not to allow ourselves to gravitate too quickly towards any apparent simplistic solutions, whatever they may be. And I think that's a really important point to remember in terms of approaching anything with a degree of complexity. It certainly informs a lot of the work that we are doing, and I think probably is reflected in some of the responses that I've given around sort of voluntary or shared care arrangements as well, recognising that complexity is there. So I'll maybe ask Georgia to come in just a moment on work around the Royal College. engagement. On education and training, I appreciate the committee, something that the committee has taken evidence on. I know I'll be very keen to consider what comes out of the committee's report, and we obviously give the undertaking that that would be shared with colleagues of the Cabinet Secretary for Education and relevant officials as well. I would not want to speak in an area out with my direct portfolio responsibilities in any detail, other than to recognise that I know as part of initial teacher training, ASN is a component of that, but I recognise that there have been matters raised pertaining to the training of teachers throughout the committee's inquiry. And of course, you know, as the government always would do, we will give careful consideration to what is produced by the committee's inquiries report, and that will be shared with the relevant minister and officials. On the engagement with the Royal College and in terms of the work that they've undertaken.
Thanks, Minister. I'd just like to also add on the teacher training question in particular. One of the projects we've funded in this financial year that gives parents access to digital support and advice, peer support, workshops, etc. That programme also gives the children, the parents of children accessing it, their teachers access to, and so we're really interested to see what the outcomes of that are and how that's received by teachers, and use that to inform kind of further thinking with our education colleagues about teacher training and opportunities there. In relation to work with the Royal College are members of our task force. They're really important members in that group, and we are continuing to work with them both in that space and also in the adult space to look at where there are gaps in our sort of support system, particularly for adults, where we can make improvements to help deliver on the step care approach that they recommend. And I think we know that there and recognise that there is more to do in that space perhaps for adults than there are in the children and young people's space. And the other thing I would just add more broadly on the training question, we have worked with NATE and also with NHS Education Scotland to develop quite a wide-ranging resources and information for people working across health and education and third sector. It's available to everybody to engage with, but I think touching back on some of the questions from Ms Chapman earlier around knowledge of those supports, I think we recognise that there's more we can do to promote the uptake of those resources, and we're working with NATE and NES to explore how we do that.
Minister, thanks to you and your officials, and thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Now I have questions from Rhoda Grant, please.
Thank you, Convener. In the evidence we took, we saw quite starkly that there is an inconsistency between the understanding of neurodiversity, not just between education authorities or between schools, but indeed between classes within the same school. And it seemed to be that kind of the approach was dependent on a teacher's understanding of different conditions and how they supported that. So I wonder what your understanding for the underlying reasons of the gap between what legislation says about additional support needs and what's the practice on the ground. And that was quite stark as well when we were speaking to people, you know, from authorities who were dealing with neurodivergence to the people on the receiving end. It was almost like we're speaking about two different things, because while those in charge of dealing with neurodivergence in statutory services seemed to understand well, that didn't percolate down to the ground to what people were experiencing.
It's I think it's a really good question, and I'll ask Robbie to come in a moment, because I think there's something to be said. Now maybe just offer some thoughts here and ask Robbie to come in for his perspective. But the point we touched on earlier about the growth in demand and the unprecedented and the unforeseen nature of it, and the way this has become, the significant increase in awareness and just that rapidity of the pace of change, I think has led to a situation where we are having to effectively recalibrate our whole systems and approach to something that, as has been touched on earlier, they were not necessarily designed for. I think even just in terms of the nature of the neurodevelopmental conditions and the definitions of them and approaches to diagnosis have evolved and developed, I think it's probably good to say, significantly in the last couple of decades as well. And so in terms of the landscape that we're inhabiting, there's been a significant amount of change. So in terms of understanding why there might be that variation that's taking place, I think that perhaps accounts for some of it. But what it speaks to is the need to improve consistency. And I think in terms of where we got to with the national specification, we have, as I touched on earlier, the policy there. But then there's that question around implementation, which speaks to the work we're doing around the task force. And then there's some of the work that Georgia touched on around information and provision for parents and teachers as well. But in terms of maybe just the way in which the nature of diagnosis and public understanding has developed over the last, and I'm saying the last 20 years, thinking 22 years since the relevant Act came into place, the 2004 Act, it's just a sense of how much has changed since then.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some very good studies, particularly into ADHD, actually asking what's the cause in this rise in demand. What is the reason that we're now seeing more kids and adults with ADHD? And the answer is we're seeing more. That the recognition has improved, the underlying incidence, the idea that there's a whole population who have been exposed to something like paracetamol in utero does not come out in the literature at all. What has happened is that society has become much better at recognising that these traits exist in the population. There are people who are historically have been disadvantaged by having these traits, who in the past were just disadvantaged. They were expected to simply fit into, I've heard it said that being neurodiverse is like being a Mac in a PC world, and that the job is to make the world more Mac friendly. And that's the nature of the problem. Now, the diagnostic nomenclatures, as they're called, DSM and ICD-10, they sort of follow societal norms, as psychiatry always has, and to an extent medicine always has. But the shift from DSM-4 to DSM-5 and from ICD-10 to ICD-11, these are the diagnostic criteria for these conditions, have subtly shifted. If we look back further, autism was Dr. Canner in a residential home for boys with learning disabilities, seeing that some of them showed traits that other kids didn't share, and called that autism. That's where it originated. And we've come a huge way in 70, 80 years in changing what we recognise as it's not just limited to those kids. It's actually a trait that's very prevalent across society, and a range of traits that are prevalent, and that these people can be helped to reduce the disadvantage that they're at. Now, that's come very rapidly, and with any change, institutions and individuals vary in their rate of adaptation to that change. And I think that your observation that in some schools it's down to one teacher has really got it and is really good with the kids with these difficulties. Other teachers are, maybe they're old dogs like me who don't learn new tricks so easily and haven't adapted. That's always going to happen with any sort of change. And I think this to be seen as a societal change, but a societal change in recognition of something that was always there.
The impact of that can be huge on individuals, because it could be access to education or not access to education, frankly, if someone can't cope without the support that they should be getting, but for whatever reason aren't. So, we talked about education for teachers, but that's about getting it right for every child. How do we make sure that nobody's left behind?
I think on that, I think this really gets to the work of the cross-sector task force, which George is heavily involved in. So maybe if you could maybe give a bit more work about, a bit more information about the review of the implementation of the specification and the work that the task force has been undertaken since then.
Certainly. Yes, so the review of the specification, something that came through really loud and clear was the pressure on teachers and sometimes the difficulty in that having that opportunity to do the continuous learning and improvement, which I think possibly Ms Grant speaks to your concerns. What we have been doing in the task force, as the Minister said, that is a co-chaired group, so it's chaired by a chief executive and a health board and an ADES representative, and I think that's been a really fundamental shift in the way that we're approaching implementation of the specification, really moving it out of the health space and bringing together education. It really is playing an important role in getting us towards further development of the implementation of the specification, which is about that holistic wraparound, all sectors supporting a child and family. I don't think there's any question that we're not there yet, but the work of the task force is helping us get there. We have some work underway to develop a clearer picture of all the different roles of professional groups that might interact with a child and family, and that will help us identify where there are gaps. And one of the things we're looking for is where there is that gap in support, training and knowledge around a child in the school arena, and looking then that will help us build on what we do to plug those gaps where professional groups might need more support to access training to fulfil their kind of responsibilities. But it is something that's in development.
Thank you. Do you have questions around the criminal justice,
yes.
Rhoda?
Do you want me to do them now? Thank you. So again, we see a lot of people in the criminal justice system, and it just almost smacks of failure because these people have been let down. So I wonder what the Scottish Government's doing to make sure that services have the resources and the knowledge to deal with people who may be being treated as offenders, but also people who may be witnesses or just involved in the criminal justice system.
I think it's important to recognise in responding to this question and to your previous question, Ms Grant, the significant work that still needs to be undertaken in terms of responding to the challenges before us. And as Robbie said, there's a societal shift in that we're seeing something that has always been there. And that, of course, is a positive, but it is now incumbent upon us collectively, and particularly for those of us in government, and leading public services and in local government as well, to ensure work is underway to utilise this enhanced understanding to ensure that services meet the needs of everyone who interacts with them, whether that be within education or within the criminal justice system. So just as there is work underway within education, similarly there is work underway within justice to ensure that whatever one's interaction with the system in whatever capacity, there is increased understanding and awareness of the needs of those individuals who are neurodivergent. Just to come a bit more specific information, I'll ask Georgia to come in.
Thank you. Yes, obviously notwithstanding, we're not the portfolio for justice, but I would like to share that there has been some Scottish Government funded work developing 5 principles for responding to communication support needs in the justice system. And there is also some work underway in the development of more accessible approaches and materials in community justice settings. This also includes a training course for justice social workers and work with the ARC Scotland organisation supporting offenders with learning disabilities. They're actively involved in all of this work, and that is aimed at supporting neurodivergent or people with learning disabilities who've received sentences for offending. So, as the Minister said, more work to be done, but work underway.
But even before that stage, you find that people who are having difficulty coping at any point in time are being dealt with by the police. The police are the first port of call if somebody has become distressed or upset. And then you find that those people are then remanded. You know, it's not the place. It's totally... It's just wrong, frankly, that people are being locked up because circumstances have caused them to have difficulties and express those difficulties. And then obviously the people that are coming to attend to them are not aware, and therefore they find themselves in the justice system for not having committed a crime but being charged with breach of the peace or something like that, and end up on remand. And it's counter, I mean, it's damaging, frankly.
I think it's a really important point, and it speaks to the need for that work, and one, increasing awareness, but ensuring that all of those who are working within our public services are equipped to respond to appropriately and compassionately and sensitive to individuals, irrespective of what their need would be. We of course know there was a great deal of focus and interest, understandably, on more widely mental health and well-being and policing. That is something that is a key area of interest to recognise for Parliament, and it is somewhere, for example, where we have been working to make progress as a government, for example, through something like the Distress Brief Intervention Initiative. But we certainly recognise that there is more work to be done, and in terms of responding to the interest of this inquiry and the wider interest that exists, I want to assure you all that there's a recognition that this is not something that just simply sits within one portfolio. And I think the breadth of interest and the range of areas, education, justice, I know there's been consideration around the economy and the workplace environment as well. It does speak to that point of this being a whole society approach, and I recognise that that presents significant challenges, but I think it is something where there is broad consensus across this Parliament. I think that was reflected in the work that's been undertaken through the Cross-Party Summit, and I think there is the means through that of working constructively, and particularly for whoever's returned in the next session of Parliament, to build on some of the work that's been undertaken to date to ensure that we're approaching this in a holistic, needs-based, whole system, whole society approach. And it's why I think in my earlier remarks, when I touched on the importance that I recognise is placed upon assessment and diagnosis, it cannot just be about assessment and diagnosis. It has to look at that whole society approach, and because in every facet of our public services it touches or impinges upon individuals' lives. When we recognise a number of people within our population who are neurodivergent, we need to ensure our public services respond compassionately and effectively and in a rights-informed manner to those individuals' needs. And I certainly recognise, Ms Grant, that there is still substantial work that we need to do. But I hope that what I've conveyed and what my colleagues here today have conveyed is that the Government is absolutely committed to doing so.
So finally, Minister, and I do recognise that this isn't specifically in your portfolio, but just finishing on the point in terms of employment, we've heard from those with lived experience who are neurodivergent and heard about their experiences within the workplace and trying to access work, and most really do want to have full access to employment and be a part of society, but just find those barriers so very difficult. And there needs to be more work with employers in this area. Just in terms of the stats, employment rates are 29% for autistic people, compared with Scotland's national employment rate of 82.5% for non-disabled people and 50.7% for disabled people. So I think that is quite stark there, especially when we hear the lived experience feedback as well, that they really do want to be having their place and a purpose in society and earning money as well for themselves to support themselves and possibly family. What can the Scottish Government do there to help support those ambitions in the workplace?
It's a really important point, and certainly something which I had direct engagement with in my previous portfolio as Employment Minister. as the committee fully appreciates, employment law is a reserved matter, but we're certainly sought to engage constructively with the UK government around their employment rights legislation and wider programme. Within our Fair Work First policy, for example, the various principles that supporting diverse and inclusive workplaces is a core theme of that, and we would encourage all employers to have workplace practices which are not only consistent with having a fair and inclusive environment, but give them access to a huge pool of talent, of creativity, of ingenuity, which is too often excluded. I can take another example. Is we will all be familiar with various initiatives that are designed to sort of promote inclusive workplace environments. I think analogously in another area, not directly what we're considering today, but around the another area of my portfolio, and something I've had a long-standing interest in even prior to being in government, which was around the Carer Positive scheme, which is all about recognising and encouraging employers to have workplace practices where those who are combining their work with unpaid caring responsibilities are recognised and supported with often quite small, reasonable adjustments that enable them to both balance their responsibilities within the workplace with their caring responsibilities as well. And we know that employers who have such policies in place are able to access a significant pool of the workforce who want to work and who want to participate. So it is very good for employers, but it's of course very good for the individual as well, who is an unpaid carer and who wants to work. Of course, recognising that employment will not be right or suitable to wishes for every single unpaid carer, just as it will be for disabled people. Not every disabled person will necessarily want to be in employment, but we know there are many who do, who are not able to access employment, and that's why we have our commitments around reducing the disability employment gap, and why we have seen progress that has been made and continue to make towards that longer term target. So within the sort of suite of the devolved levers available to us, where we don't have that statutory power, we certainly seek to, through our convening and our influence and our engagement, to promote best practice in the workplace, both from the perspective of ensuring that you have a society that is inclusive and everyone who wants the opportunity to participate in the workforce is able to do so, but also recognising as well that in Scotland we face some significant economic challenges related to our demography. We have unemployment at very low levels, we have an ageing population, and we are operating within a restrictive environment around migration because of the policies of the UK government. So we've been able to create every opportunity to fully utilise the workforce within Scotland and to ensure that those who do want to participate within the workplace are able to do so free of discrimination and barriers is of the utmost importance. So of course there's things that we would like to be able to do that we are not able to do, going to the devolution settlement. More engagement and involvement with the Access to Work scheme would be one example. But I would want to say very clearly, and I hope this is something that the committee will reiterate, is that employers are really should be taking, I know many employers do, but should be really taking every opportunity to ensure that they have diverse and inclusive recruitment practices so that they can fully utilise all of the talent that we're so fortunate to have in our country. And many neurodivergent individuals are making a huge contribution to society at all levels, and I'm sure many of them in this building as well.
That's great. Thank you very much, Minister, and that's a great point to end on there. I want to thank you and your officials once again for attending this afternoon now, and we will now suspend while we discuss the remaining items in private on the rest of our agenda. Thank you.